I'm going to show you a framework for the key phases for mentoring somebody. There's been a lot written about the relational dynamics between official mentor and mentee to create an atmosphere for growth. Some people approach this almost like the mentors are quasi-therapists or career counselors, where they emphasize building trust and establishing rapport. And I will say, yes, that is critical advice. Nevertheless, in contrast, this video is going to help you focus on a big picture, almost mechanical approach to the key phases of mentoring people on specific skills and experiences. I believe you can layer these 4 phases I'll show you over all the other great advice out there about good listening and respect and approachability. You can use this as a mental model to help lots of people around you, whether they're learning something in 1 hour or 1 year. If your company doesn't have an official training program, you can use this approach. If you want to make sure somebody on your team is prepared for a promotional opportunity when it comes up, you can use this approach. I don't know who first put these 4 steps into a written framework. I heard it from a friend, but he said he read it in a book, but that it wasn't original to that author either. In practice, I would guess that these steps go back literally thousands of years. Either way, here they are. The first step is that you do it. Another variation I've seen in this step is that you do it, they watch. And this means you should be pretty good at the thing you're doing if there's any complexity or sophistication in what you're teaching them. In other words, ideally, you should be mentoring people, first and foremost, in areas you have expertise and experience. Now, on the other side of the coin, the point comes with a caveat. Yes, you can help people in many cases, even if you have just a little more experience than they do. Sometimes people who are just a little further down the road can be effective role models because for these basic skills, they know exactly what it's like to be in your shoes. At the same time, the best situation is for you to have real-world experience doing the whole thing you're mentoring them on. If you want to teach people how to fly a plane, for example, it's a good idea that you already know how to fly from takeoff to landing. To do that, make sure you know your stuff and don't rush off to give people advice until you do. When I first got started in the world of communication, speaking, and coaching, I did an internship at a management consulting firm in Los Angeles that specialized in communication, leadership, and executive coaching. I was learning from consultants who had been working with high-level corporate clients for years, and in some cases, decades. In other words, they could check this first box with confidence. They were doing it. They had graduate degrees and real-world experiences needed to mentor people like me. They were doing it, and as soon as I was hired, I started watching them. If you don't have an educational background or experience like that yet, then the first step is not to become a mentor right away, but to find mentors and learn from people who are already great at it. So the first step is you do it, or you do it and they watch. The second step is you do it, they help. This is where you do most of the project, most of the work, but you let them help in meaningful ways. You're the pilot, they're the co-pilot. This is an incredibly powerful way to teach somebody. You're side by side, and they get to observe you and do your thing and assist you in small ways at first, and then in larger ways in time. My brother did this with his 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter, when it came to riding and fixing motorcycles. He knew what he was doing, and in time they wanted to learn from him. At first, he would do most of the work, and they were working alongside him, handing him tools, helping him, holding things in place, and he'd explain what he was doing. They did small parts of the job that were reasonable for their level of experience. I went through something similar in a corporate setting when I was interning at that consulting firm I mentioned. For the first couple of months, I just watched, and I shadowed different consultants while they were doing one-on-one executive coaching or they were putting on workshops for groups. After a couple of months of observing and learning from them, they let me help by doing a very small piece of the work. If there was a half-day workshop, they might let me present for 10 minutes of that right in the middle, something safe. And the rest of the time I was observing, I was taking notes. And as I watched them do it, they encouraged me to think how I would do it if I were in their shoes presenting for the rest of the time. And then we'd debrief the experience on the drive home. A couple of weeks later, they'd let me do a half hour of that half-day workshop, and then eventually an hour. We were co-presenting, but I was a helper. They'd also ask me to help on other tasks behind the scenes in the office, like generating reports, analyzing data. Again, they did most of the work, and they would assign a small piece of each of those projects to me until those small pieces got bigger. They'd give me feedback on how I was doing. They'd teach me additional skills, inch by inch, over days, weeks, and months. They did this for every single part of my job. So the second step of mentoring is you do it, they help. And the third step is they do it, you help. This is where the equation begins to flip. You let them pilot the plane and you act as their co-pilot. And it takes a lot of humility on the part of the mentor to make this move and restrain yourself from jumping in too much. Individuals who struggle with control have difficulty mentoring people this way because they're afraid of the inevitable mistakes the mentee will make. Either way, this phase is where the mentee begins doing most of the job and the mentor is supposed to step back and assist, give feedback, give encouragement. At some point, each of my older brother's 4 children knew what they were doing enough to take the lead on fixing whatever needed to be fixed on their motorcycles. My brother would be the one to hand them the tools and give them encouragement. He'd even leave the garage so they could fight through some parts of it on their own, and he'd swing back by to check in on them. If they got stuck, he'd get hands-on and help them through the most difficult parts until they can do it on their own. And the same thing happened to me in the consulting firm. A few senior consultants coached me up to the point where they thought I was ready to present all of a workshop. They would still work directly with the client organization to book it and design it. They'd still be there in the room in some cases, and they'd be letting me present the vast majority of the workshop by this point and eventually present all of it when I was ready. The first workshop I did as a standalone presenter for that consulting firm was a 1-hour breakout session in Las Vegas for a Fortune 500 company. I remember it so clearly because it was the first time the other consultants were not in the room at all with me. Of course, we talked immediately after on the break and they collected feedback from the client on my session. They were still helping me, but it was a huge turning point because I was able to go out there on my own, at least to some degree. And this is the point at which they stopped treating me like I was a mere intern and started treating me like I was a real member of the consulting team, even though I was an extremely junior member of the team who still needed help. This third phase is they do it, you help. And that leads to the final phase of the mentoring process, that is, they do it. Or a variation is they do it, you watch. This is the phase where you say to the mentee, you're ready to do this on your own. You give them a little nudge of encouragement, get them out of their comfort zone, and let them be the pilot of their own little plane with no co-pilot. And that doesn't mean they're permanently on their own. They might only be ready to do one specific part of the job on their own, but they are now doing it themselves. And this is what it felt like when my son got his driver's license and started taking the car out on his own. He wasn't ready to be a NASCAR driver or take a cross-country road trip on his own, but he was ready to go back and forth to the store. In the same way, my brother's kids can now work on their motorcycles without help. The consulting firm did this for me as well. By this point, I'd moved from Los Angeles to Colorado to get my PhD, so I didn't work in the building with them anymore, but they started sending me out to client organizations to do entire workshops on my own. Now, sometimes they would bring me into a large offsite and they were there to work with a client, and I'd be like an extra consultant in another breakout room like they were. On other days, I was the only consultant with the client. They would just schedule workshops in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Palm Springs, and I would do the whole thing on my own numerous times per year. Now, they would still watch from afar by looking at client feedback and debriefing with me on a call, let's say, but the final stage was they do it, and that's where I was at that point. Those are the overall 4 big picture steps of this mentoring framework. As long as you have a lot of confidence on the first step, you really know your stuff, in other words, then you can start informally mentoring people right away on specific skills. Obviously, in the middle 2 steps, there's lots of variation, nuance, and possibilities depending upon what you're mentoring them to do. But in some way, somehow, you have to begin letting them do increasing amounts of work on their own and begin to take a back seat where you transition to the role of helper, observer, and feedback provider. The idea is once a mentee can do it on their own and they continue to gain experience, they'll be more equipped to start mentoring people as well in time. Feel free to take a look at my website for free downloads, a free course, and other resources. Till next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.